We evolved over millennia on this planet with our biggest source of light, of course, being the rising and setting of the sun. That circadian rhythm is so important to every single function in the body. Modern life has really removed us from that primary signal of natural light hitting our eyes and skin. I mean, it's all really guided by this information that natural light provides. Or on the flip side, that artificial light provides and then sort of deranges that signaling process.
Welcome back to Decentralized Radio, your one-stop shop for education on how you can take back control of your health and your wealth and live outside of the centralized systems that are plaguing our society. We're hosting industry experts every Tuesday live and also releasing podcasts Friday morning.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Decentralized Radio. Today, having a conversation that I've wanted to have for a long time with Dr. Catherine Clinton. Catherine, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. I'm excited to talk about all my favorite things with you.
Yeah, it really is very aligned, and we've had a few podcast episodes diving into, quantum biology, I guess unofficially, talking about water, talking about fascia with Carrie, with Dr. Gerald Pollack, and, we've talked about EMFs and light quite extensively here as well. So it's exciting, and it's exciting to talk to a practitioner that's applying these principles, in the real world, and also educating, quite a bit. And I think it's really important. So we can go down a lot of rabbit holes, but I don't think that we have had someone define what quantum biology actually is as a field. And you might be the perfect person to do that. So why don't we start there?
That's a great place to start. And I'll give you a couple different definitions because there isn't consensus, and a lot of people would disagree with some of the things that I define as quantum biology. So quantum biology is an emerging field. There are dedicated university departments, UC Berkeley, Surrey, and they're looking at quantum effects such as entanglement, tunneling, superposition, coherence in living systems. Now, there's a growing movement to utilize quantum biological perspective in health. And so when we're defining it as in a health context, we're looking at how photons of light, how phonons from sound, vibration, frequency, EMFs, electromagnetic fields, magnetism, how these things interact with our subatomic particles, our flow of electrons, our protons. And we can see that in our mitochondrial function. We can see that in our cellular communication. And so that's how I'm defining quantum biology in the health space. But if you were to stroll through my social media, you would know that some people don't agree with that, right? Some people really want to keep quantum biology in the realm of quantum computing, because that's where a lot of the research started, was how do we take the efficiency of photosynthesis and utilize it for quantum computing, right? So the idea that we would use this for health really upsets people. But there's a wealth of information out there showing the benefits of utilizing light, utilizing sound, utilizing water, utilizing frequency for health benefits. And I think to relegate it only to quantum computing is a huge mistake and misunderstanding of the information out there.
That's really quite interesting. I didn't know that there was such like a defensive position around quantum biology, because that is what a lot of people hear the word quantum in regards to physics and then quantum computers. But it would be kind of short-sighted to not want to apply that to our own biology, our own health. And to me, it's really just getting down to the nitty-gritty, to the the particle level where you can't go smaller. And then it's like, if you can understand it at that level, you can understand it a bit better, a bit deeper. But that's where things tend to get a little spooky, as we know, with physics. So it is really quite cool. And for me, it's like, it makes you realize how little we actually know about what's going on in the world, what's going on in nature, and what's going on in our bodies. And I'm curious how an ND like yourself, like obviously, you know, holistic mindset is kind of what you guys are taught and what most NDs practice. How did you find quantum biology? What was like something that drew you in? Because I feel like once you embrace it and you go down a few rabbit holes, you're so enamored with learning, because there's so much to learn and still.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It was rabbit hole after rabbit hole, right? And what happened was I was in my second year of naturopathic medical school. And so it's a graduate 4-year program. And we study a lot of the same things that allopathic MDs study, um, but also sort of what's known as green allopathy, right? So we're looking at botanicals and lifestyle. And I got really sick. It was my second year of school, and it was that initiation phase of medical school. Um, really long hours, really intensely studying and sort of competitive, right, too. And so I was diagnosed with 2 autoimmune conditions and Lyme disease. I just sort of like the dominoes fell. And the physician that I was mentoring under, and who was also my physician, she was really encouraging me to look at psychoneuroimmunology. And that's just a big word for how our thoughts and emotions impact our biological state, our inflammatory state, our immune system, hormonal state. And of course, she was right. And at the time, I was looking at mitochondrial function and just researching as much as I could there. And I read a research article, well, several research articles from Martin Picard. And he was looking at the effects of our mental state on mitochondrial function. And that just blew me away. And at the same time, I was looking at some of the early quantum biological research coming out of UC Berkeley from Greg Engel and Graham Fleming. And they were looking at photosynthetic bacteria and how a photosynthetic bacteria or a photosynthetic cell takes a photon of light and gets it to the photosynthetic reaction center for photosynthesis to occur, and how that can happen at almost 100% efficiency. Because like the dominant model says, okay, it meanders around. It like bumps around the thylakoid proteins until it randomly gets there, right? Random. And mathematically, that's impossible at near 100% efficiency. And what they found was not only because that photon is a quantum sized particle, right? It's a quanta of light, meaning that it can utilize quantum effects like superposition, taking multiple paths at one time. But they found that the proteins in that cell were using quantum coherence. They were working together. And coherence really is talking about how 2 or more things can work as one, can work as a unit. And that's what these proteins were doing. These thylakoid proteins in this photosynthetic cell were coming together, what the researchers termed a quantum beat, but it's known as quantum coherence. They were working together to vibrate to keep that photon on its fastest path. And that's what blew me away at the same time as reading about mitochondrial research and the effect of our mind, and this idea that there's this frequency language happening throughout the body, whether it's water, like you talked with Jerry Pollack about, Professor Pollack, or the frequency of electricity or magnetism or scalar or light or sound. All of these things have a common denominator of frequency that the body can utilize to initiate biological action. It's fascinating.
This podcast is brought to you by our lead sponsor, EMRtek. EMRtek manufactures high-quality, high-powered red light therapy devices. In my opinion, red and infrared light are 2 of the biggest nutrient deficiencies in our modern society due to our indoor lifestyles. Red light therapy devices devices like the ones from EMRtek can help combat that by providing high-powered red light while being indoors. I personally use mine every morning and every evening. Red and near infrared light is extremely beneficial for energy production in our body because it boosts mitochondrial function and penetrates deep into the cell. It is also extremely beneficial for skin health, eye health, as well as our circadian rhythms. And this is actually pretty much why I bought everyone in my family an EMRtek red light therapy device for Christmas. EMRtek panels are low flicker, low EMF, and use targeted wavelengths such as 830 and 630 nanometers, amongst others, to get extremely effective results. For more information, go to emrtek.com and use our code DRADIO10 for 10% off your order. That's emrtek.com with our code DRADIO, DRADIO 10 to save at checkout.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much there to unpack. I feel like, you define coherence, which is extremely important. You're talking about mitochondria, and really, I feel like that's the center of a lot of this, because they are those, electromagnetic, they're the center of all of this because they're the electromagnetic sensors, or the quantum sensors that you could say, of our environment. And the way, as an engineer, I think about everything as like input signals, really, to our body, to our mitochondria. And, we've completely distorted these input signals. We have a higher, or a lower signal to noise ratio than ever. So, just starting out, you mentioned water, kind of like these hallmarks of quantum biology. But to me, it comes down to, how these particles, the electrons, protons, photons, phonons that you mentioned, are interacting. And what do you think is the best way to describe the interactions between photons and phonons, so light and sound, and then, electrons and protons? Because that's, I think, probably the most important thing for people to grasp. And it can vary depending, of course, on the environment, the stimuli, and the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think zooming out on a really basic level is looking at how these quantum particles, like electrons and protons, are excited by a photon of light or a phonon of sound or a frequency at a certain hertz, right? It's this energizing capacity of our environment and the frequency that we're exposed to, whether that's light or sound or fields of energy, electrical, magnetic, and how they excite and move and oscillate, vibrate these quantum particles, these subatomic electrons, protons. And when we're talking about the mitochondria, that's everything, right? That pressure buildup of protons in that inner mitochondrial membrane space, right? We've got that little jelly bean that we think of, that we learned in school as the mitochondria. And then that squiggly line is that inner membrane where the electron transport chain is, right? And those four complexes, and then that fifth ATP synthase is housed in that wiggly line of that jelly bean of the mitochondria, right? And so that buildup of protons in that inner membrane space and the flow of the electrons through that chain. Now, that was really simplistic. We know that mitochondria are moving and dynamic, and they don't really look like jelly beans, and it's not really a chain. It's more like a circle. But, just to break it down to some ideas that are familiar from elementary school, middle school biology, that this flow of electrons through the mitochondria, that pressure buildup of protons and that flow of protons creating ATP as well as cellular signals is foundational to whatever we're talking about, because our mitochondria are energy providers of the cell. They are our cellular, like you said, sensors, right? They're like antenna that can pick up on environmental signals inside the cell, inside the body, externally in our environment, and then they relay that information throughout the body. So they're this central hub of communication and energy production, which, I mean, we know from the research of Douglas Wallace and other scientists that any dip in mitochondrial function we can associate with almost every chronic disease out there, right? So it becomes really, really important to look at these smaller pieces because they start to fit the pieces back together, right? When I was in school, there was a study that came out saying antioxidants didn't show any benefit in lung cancer. In fact, they showed the opposite, right? They showed that it actually was detrimental. And as a naturopathic student, nutrition was so important. It was like, oh, what did they do wrong in the study? And what are they trying to like pull over on us, right? But really, when you look at something like that, we're not seeing the full picture. We're not seeing that a constant influx and an enormous influx of anti-inflammatory antioxidants can quelch that cellular signal of the mitochondria and that communication in the body that needs to happen, right? Not saying that antioxidants are bad, but this black and white thinking that we have of the body becomes much more sophisticated and nuanced, which we desperately need at this time because we are in a huge epidemic of chronic disease.
Yeah, that one's always really interesting to dive down. And it's really just thinking that we can outsmart nature, outsmart our biology. And yeah, having antioxidants to quench free radicals is helpful. But at the same time, those free radicals and reactive oxygen species, like you said, they're being used as a means of communication. And something else that you kind of alluded to already is that light is kind of a means of communication and information. And we've talked about it a little bit, but maybe we can get into how is this like light show, which you could call it, going on in our body? Because we have, the environmental light that we're being exposed to, which should be mostly in the form of sunlight. You're outside, which is amazing. I'm trying to get outside more. At least I have decent windows that are letting through some infrared. But then we have we emit light. We have biophotons that are ongoing, which is a whole quantum rabbit hole. So how do you like to think about the light show that's going on in our body and how that's affecting communication and cell function?
Yeah, absolutely. Externally, that light environment that we're living in, we evolved over millennia on this planet with our biggest source of light, of course, being the rising and setting of the sun. And so what we've found is that circadian rhythm is so important to every single function in the body, right? It was 2017. 3 researchers were awarded the Nobel Prize for their work on what's termed chronobiology, basically how light impacts the body. And so modern life has really removed us from that primary signal of natural light hitting our eyes and skin from sunrise to sundown, and then respecting that it is sundown and the light's lower, and that our body also needs those signals of darkness. So there's that external component of light acting as a signal. And I mean, it is setting up our neurotransmitter production, our hormonal production, our inflammatory state, our cardiovascular function, respiratory, digestion, immune. I mean, it's all really guided by this information that natural light provides, or on the flip side, that artificial light provides and then sort of deranges that signaling process. And then when we're talking about the light inside and biophoton emission, we see that biophotons are created by the mitochondria, by the DNA, and by these reactive oxidative species. And it was Fritz Albert Popp who kind of expanded on some research on onion mitosis, right? So as these onion cells were dividing, there was this flash of light, and people wondered what was going on with that. And Pop really extended that research to show that all living cells create this ultra weak light emission. We can't see it with our naked eyes right now, but it certainly exists. It's being utilized by all kinds of industries, the medical industry, agricultural industries, the food industries. And what Pop found was that this light emission was not random. It was coherent, really implying that there are these light messages and conversations in the body. And going back to that study we were just talking about with antioxidants, quenching those reactive oxidative species, yes, too much of those can cause damage, but getting rid of those can also perhaps stop this communication in the body, right? That's what the research seems to imply. And when you look about it, it's really this Goldilocks zone, right? So too little biophoton emission suggests an unhealthy cell. Too much biophoton emission is really indicative of a stress cell, almost like an SOS, like, hey, check this out. You guys need to come help over here, like a distress signal. And in between those two is the light emission of a healthy cell. So we can see that the research is really starting to understand and imply that there is a light conversation happening within us. And that's something that is important. And again, it comes back to respecting that we're just starting to understand a piece, right? Do I think that quantum biology or quantum physics answers it all? Absolutely not, right? We're just scratching at the surface, but it's exciting to understand a deeper level of communication and a deeper level of respect to have for biological action, right? It's not just these jelly beans making ATP in the body. It's this incredibly complex and sophisticated communication system happening within us.
Yeah, it is incredible. It's actually unbelievable, really, because you look down at this level and, there's hundreds or thousands of mitochondria in each cell, trillions of cells in our body. And then each mitochondria, there's, ATPases, which are little motors that you talked about. It is unbelievable. And the biophoton emission is also something that's really cool, and I'm glad there's more research focusing on this area. I didn't know that too little was also a problem, but I remember reading when I first found out that a high amount of biophoton emission is actually a bad thing, but is really fascinating. And I guess maybe for people to better grasp this, because I haven't talked about it too much, how exactly is this biophoton emission occurring? So we have the way I see it is we have this excitation of electrons, and when they come back to ground state, there's some, photonic energy being released there. But maybe you could do a better job of explaining it from the beginning of when the electron becomes excited to when that biophoton emission is happening.
Yeah, no, I think that your explanation is a great one. And we're seeing this biophoton emission in mitochondria, in DNA, and these reactive oxidative species. And so much of quantum biology or quantum electrodynamics looks at this flux in energy states. And when you go from an excited state to a ground state, the emission of energy being a source of communication or even a source of energy, right? When you start to look at the quantum electrodynamics of water and some of the work around, preparata and and Ling and St. George, so many different people, this idea that that flux in energy is not only acting as a signal to bring things in, but it's acting as a energy source in the body. And so contrary to what dominant medicine is doing right now and just completely ignoring this subatomic conversation, it looks like it is foundational to biological action and our health. So I think that I th- I am excited for more funding, more research, and more investigation into this because biophoton emission, the research has not progressed since Pop's death, right? Several years ago. There's no one really keeping up this research. And I'm working with a researcher down in UC San Francisco to look at mitochondrial function, specifically with coherence, and to assess biophoton emission as well, because I'm certainly no Pop, right? But we have to sort of keep that dialogue going, and hopefully somebody will continue that work and will create as a robust wealth of information that Pop did.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to mention that at the end, but we could say it right now is, to me, yeah, the biggest concern is the funding of this field and the funding of research that matters. And, you could call it decentralized science, whatever you want to say, is a huge concern. But I feel like we have some momentum now because of the internet, platforms, social media, education. It's becoming more well known, and folks like Jim Al-Khalili writing books. There's a few foundations out there like the Guy Foundation, and I know Gerald Pollack's been mentioning it for years. So I'm really optimistic, but it does all come back to money, and I feel like we're gonna have to kind of find these alternative sources and really bring it to people's attention as a very important topic. So hopefully we can do that successfully in the next few decades.
Just in the last year, I've held a couple of fundraisers for the water conference, for sound research. And of course, these labs, like Pollock's lab, needs millions to operate, right? And that's not what I was able to fundraise, right? But enough to kind of keep that together. And I'm just one person. And that was driven by people who care about this research. It wasn't fancy donors. It wasn't wealthy people. It was people like you and I who care about this research pitching in. And so that was really hopeful to me that we can create this kind of bottom up grassroots revolution, because we know that it's not going to come from the top down, right? And so I found a lot of hope in that as well.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, and that's why what you're doing is so inspiring. Your master classes, pretty much like everything you do, I feel like is contributing back to the research, which is so important because, yeah, unfortunately, equipment, labs, they're very expensive. We're talking millions of dollars, and the NIH and big pharma is not going to fund anything in this realm at all because they have no incentive. So that's where we've talked to a lot of Bitcoiners on this show. I'm a Bitcoiner. I do think that there is a future where people who kind of create their wealth in a way that is kind of has a sovereign or decentralized mindset behind it. They want to give back in the future, and I do believe we'll have a lot more people willing to fund this kind of stuff as we educate them and bring them over to the fact that, hey, the best things for health are free and accessible and decentralized and rooted in nature. We just need to kind of get more money to prove that, and then we can know even more. So that's what's really fun, and that kind of leads into a topic that is really understudied for the magnitude of its importance is water, right? And you mentioned Pollock, you mentioned Preparata, I've mentioned Del Giudice on the show, Ling. Water to me is probably the most important aspect of our biology at a high level, just because of its prevalence and its interactions with so many areas of our body. How do you go about explaining, water? Because we've had Pollock talk about the structured water, the battery, but really I feel like the coherence and the communication and the energy flows is something that you describe pretty well, and then also how it works with collagen and the fascial network. So what is your high level overview of water and its role in our biology for people to digest?
Artificial blue light from technology is destroying our health. It disrupts melatonin production, sleep quality, and our circadian rhythms, which has been linked to pretty much all chronic disease. It also rewires our dopamine reward system, which makes it addictive by design. That is why I'm so thankful to have found the Daylight computer, the first company in the world making a computer that has a blue light free screen. They use paper reflective screen technology, so it's blue light free, flicker free, eye strain free, and is easily used outdoors, so you can use technology while getting the benefits of full spectrum sunlight. For more information, you can listen to our recent podcast with the founder of Daylight Computer, Anjan, on his incredibly inspiring story on why he wants to bring technology to the masses that is not detrimental to our health. You can go to buy.daylightcomputer.com/DRADIO to pre-order the Daylight tablet today and begin using your technology in a fashion that's way more in line with our biology and nature.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like your audience is familiar with Pollock's work, right? And this idea that when water comes in contact with a hydrophilic surface, a water-loving surface, the structure of that water changes, right? It becomes more viscous. He proposes a hexagonal structure, acting as a template for more of that structured water to form. And what builds that structured water? Infrared energy, right? And that structured water is negatively charged. And as it builds, it kicks out a hydrogen, a positively charged hydrogen, a proton, and creates what's called a proton rich zone or a proton wire. And he did an incredible experiment in his laboratory where he put an electrode in the negatively charged water and one in that positively charged zone. And that separation of charge between those two different structures of water was like the separation of charge in a 9-volt battery. And it was enough to create energy. It actually lit up an LED light bulb in the laboratory. And so this is what he and so many people and myself refer to as this water battery inside of us. And we can see from different research out there that this water battery, or this lining of structured water around our cells, our fascia, has been associated with better health, right? So we can see this in cancerous cells. We can see this in the work of John Stuart Reed and the cymatics of water and the patterns of those cymographs of different healthy cells versus cancerous cells. Most of this is done with cancerous cells versus healthy cells, right? And so what we're looking at is a lot of research that seems to point as it being a part of our biology that needs to be robust, right? I would even go further and say that not only is it just this area in our body that we need to have be robust and functioning well, like our mitochondria, I would say just like our mitochondria, it's participating in this body-wide communication. And without that ability to communicate, then a cell becomes unhealthy, right? That's sort of like the definition of cancer. That cell becomes isolated. It can't communicate. It can't participate in the things that a healthy cell does, and it becomes cancerous, right? And so I really look at it as this communication and information carrier in the body. And you mentioned fascia. that's one of the areas that we see that a lot in is these collagen tubules. And coming back to Professor Pollock and his laboratory in the University of Washington, he submerged a collagen tubule. And what he saw was that that tubule creates structured water on the outside. So he submersed it in water. He exposed it to infrared energy. And what he saw quite readily is that the outside of that tubule creates that structured water we're talking about. And the inside of that collagen tube does the same thing. And the interesting thing about that is that proton wire or rich zone creates an indefinite flow of water, of particles, of protons and proton jump conduction in the center of that tubule. And when you look at our fascia is this triple helix of collagen. They're called tropocollagen nanotubules. So we're talking very, very small, right? These collagen tubules create this body-wide network where our collagen and our fascia is connecting to every single structure in the body. And there's this continuous flow of information from our superficial collagen to our dermal collagen to our visceral collagen, right? The deep collagen and fascia that is surrounding our vital organs, our liver, our heart, for example. And we see that this can even be inserted to a cell via integrins, right? And this beautiful communication happening from our mitochondria, from our fascia, from our lymph, from our nervous system to create this entire sort of quantum communication network where this idea of resonance and proton jump conduction has a vehicle that we now can pinpoint, right? And there's amazing research out of Korea and Japan and China really associating the fascia as an anatomical place for meridians and for the effects of acupuncture, acupressure, and this energy flow, right? And so it's incredible to sort of come full circle back to some of this ancient indigenous knowledge that was sort of tossed aside with the scientific revolution and really appreciate this role of water. And I mean, we could chase this down even further if we wanted to and talk about microtubules and the water inside them as this conductor of frequency information. It's fascinating, and I think we can end every single topic with, I wish there was more funding because we need more research and evidence, because this is so important to understanding how our body works, to understanding how our health works. I think that so many of us in the medical field, especially over the last 5 years, when I graduated, my patients and their symptom picture is much different. They have evolved. Their conditions, the things we're seeing in practice are much different than they were even 5 years ago. And our medicine is not evolving at the same pace. We need to have a deeper exploration into what's happening inside of us.
Yeah, wow. I remember reading Maywan Ho's articles on like jump conduction, and that blowing my mind. So I still need to go and fully read her book. It's been a large undertaking, and yeah, there's so much to unpack there. I feel like there's so much to research, like you said, and the way I think about it, and you mentioned the microtubules. You've shared on your page how that can increase like conduction, electrical conduction in the brain tremendously, and there's so much to unpack and learn from water. But I'm curious, with your knowledge, we talk about the coherent domains, but now you're talking about the issues with uh, symptoms and kind of disease manifestation and how that's changing. And of course, yeah, our standard medical practice is decades behind. but how do you think about our environment and how that's affecting the water network, the communication, really, we could say, and causing this incoherence? Because from my understanding, we're constantly breaking coherence, forming coherence, forming, breaking hydrogen bonding networks. Like, this is happening quite rapidly, but our environment is probably dictating a lot of that. So I guess some negative impacts or aspects that are altering the communication system.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, um, going back to good old Professor Pollack and his work, he had a research study out there showing that structured water formation degrades next to wireless routers. And I think that the pace at which we've been inundating our environment with different wireless tech, with man-made toxins. I mean, we're sort of the third generation or the second generation of people who are in this experiment with this industrialization of our food supply, right? Glyphosate is just one of them. And our grandparents were the first to experience that, right? Our parents, I know I grew up with all of that stuff, all of that processed food, even though my parents were sort of like, hippies, they grew sprouts, they tried to provide good food. We didn't have sugary cereals or stuff like that, but everything was processed and sprayed. And that's something that has become unavoidable, right? Like even our organic food is inundated with these toxins. And so looking at what's happening with this cellular communication, if it depends on these water networks that can't build in the face of toxins, in the face of wireless tech, then we're facing some pretty big obstacles in our modern day life, right? And I say that at the same time as I respect the body's resilience. Right. Like when I was in environmental medicine, it was really a depressing class because it's like your air is polluted, your soil's polluted, the food's polluted, your mind's polluted. I mean, it was just like all of it. But at the same time, our body has pathways and detoxification functions that are more brilliant than the people coming up with these chemicals, right? And so what we're terming forever chemicals, if you look at the environmental agencies, they I think the last thing I read, the last research I read was like 7.5 years. So if we stopped having any of these forever chemicals, our body could get rid of them in 7.5 years. The problem is we can't avoid them. So this idea that they're forever chemicals is really what should be called forever exposure. And that puts the blame away from these magical chemicals that we can't possibly stand up against and puts the blame and points the finger at the people that keep putting them in our environment, because that's the problem. And so when we're talking about modern society and what we're dealing with nowadays, we're dealing with a lot of toxins that obstruct this network that we're talking about. And I think it's, again, really important to have a bottom up demand for this to stop, right? Because it's not that our bodies aren't brilliant. They are brilliant and they are intelligent, but people keep dumping this stuff into our environment and it's not okay. Someone asked me the other day, well, should we get rid of our computers? And it's like, no, we should make our tech not so devastatingly unhealthy for us, right? We are smart enough to come up with these solutions and people have, but that's not the marketplace that's supported by our governments and the powers that be. So that was sort of a rant. But
Are you self-employed or a small business owner and are tired of paying hundreds of dollars a month to centralized health insurance companies for minimal coverage? because there is no alternative? Well, I have good news for you. There is. And this podcast is brought to you by Crowd Health. Crowd Health is a more decentralized alternative to health insurance, and it uses community and crowdfunding to help its members pay for emergencies when they do happen. They incentivize and prioritize health and personal responsibility and share the thought that you should really only be using the centralized healthcare system when emergencies do happen. This is what I am on board with, and I have personally signed up for Crowd Health since I left the corporate engineering world and the medical benefits that come with it. If you want to learn more, you can check out our episode with CEO and founder Andy Schoonover, or you can head over to joincrowdhealth.com and use code DRADIO, DRADIO, when you sign up to get a discounted rate of only $99 for the first 3 months. Centralized healthcare is one of the biggest issues in our society today, and I really love what Crowd Health is doing to provide an alternative for people who care.
No, you're spot on. Well, I don't know if you've heard, but that's exactly what we're doing at the Daylight Computer Company. So I'll have to tell you more about that when we jump off. But it's spot on, and I think about these 7.5 years, the constant exposure, and something you mentioned there, our mindset. I feel like it can be a real challenge getting into the health space, and then all of a sudden you know too much. You know everything's toxic, everything is a stressor. We're all doomed, and I feel like that actually can have such an impact on your health, because like you're saying, we need to get back to believing that we are resilient, because we are. And I'm curious how intention, how psychological aspects, you mentioned earlier with Martin Picard's work, but getting into intention, also memory and trauma, how that affects our health, our water, because that's something you talk about, and it's really interesting, and people kind of overlook this as very esoteric and woo-woo, but I feel like it could be the most important aspect of really all of this. And
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think, going back to the beginning of our conversation and talking about those photosynthetic cells, and of course, those photons are acting like quantum particles, right? They're able to do all this incredible stuff. But for me, the really incredible thing was the capacity of these proteins to act together in coherence to make that quantum effect meaningful, right? They kept it on its fastest path to create photosynthesis. And when we're talking about coherence in the body, we're talking about this idea of energy flow and everything working together as one, right? And so as a naturopathic physician who's been trained in this holistic, everything is like holistic. That to me is the definition, the true definition of holistic is the body working as one, as a symphony to play that vital song of life. And I think that the research from HeartMath Institute has been incredibly powerful for their work on heart coherence, right? And they've clearly shown through squid measurements that magnetic field of the heart is bigger than any electromagnetic field in the body. And we can measure a cell, we do EEGs of the brain all the time, but the heart is so much bigger than that. And we're finding that it entrains these other magnetic fields, electromagnetic fields. And when the body is working in coherence with that magnetic field of the heart, and when that field is primed by a state of gratitude or awe or joy, then it's like a ripple effect, right? It's like when you walk into a piano shop and you strike the C key on a piano and all the other pianos start to play that same note. This idea that our biology can work in the same way. And whenever I start talking about heart coherence, I like to sort of add this disclaimer that our bodies and our minds, our emotional state, we're humans. We're not meant to live in this love and light and everything's okay and I can't get angry, I can't be sad, I can't have fear. Those are natural human emotions. But I think what we find on the flip side of that, like on the flip side of fear, is gratitude. On the flip side of sorrow is love, right? Grief, coming back to that idea of love. And I think from an emotional coherence standpoint, I really like to leave space for all of those emotions. And if we make space for them, then eventually we do come back to that state of coherence. And so much of what is talked about in heart coherence is, okay, when you take some deep breaths, when you get into this state of coherence, when you sink down into your heart center and feel a feeling of gratitude, of love, of joy, then that heart coherence can start to entrain other things in the body. And that's true. But I have been hooked up to some really sophisticated heart coherence technology to measure heart coherence. And I was nervous. I was a little scared. I was at one point deeply sad. They led me through this whole emotional thing at the time, right? It was this. I was getting prolotherapy from a couple people, Dr. Schaffner and Kelly Kennedy. And so they had me in this really sort of awkward position. They started talking about my father who had recently passed away. So I had all these what are not coherent emotions. But if you looked at what was happening to my measured heart coherence, it was so high and it didn't dip when I felt those emotions, because right on the other side of that grief was love for my father, right? And so I want to caution people, just like the environmental piece and the toxins, I want to caution people on this idea that there are toxic emotions. If we get stuck in that, or if we have friction where we're judging that feeling and we're judging our anger and turning it into blame, or we're trying to repress emotions or judge them, feel guilty about them or not inadequate, that can cause an incoherence. But the simple emotion can be really beautiful. And that state of coherence, I think, is foundational to this communication we're talking about, right? This ability for things to entrain other aspects of biology, whether that's a water-lined cell or a what is termed a coherent domain in water. It's this idea that all of those things are working as a unit and can pick up information. And so I think for me personally, that is the foundation of what we're referring to as quantum biology in this talk, right? This capacity to pick up on signals, to pick up on frequencies, and utilize that as a whole.
Yeah, it's a really powerful message, and I think it's certainly true that we shouldn't shy away from, emotional expression, but if you get caught in a toxic or a chronic state, then it can affect your biology. And it seems to be true that, water can hold memory, and fascia can store traumatic experiences through that water. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because that's really fascinating to me. And there's people practicing myofascial release to help restore or kind of release some of that tension and trauma. And then I just think it's crazy how potentially water can store memory when these bonds, these domains are constantly forming and reforming. So how is that even actually happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, right? That we haven't fully answered. And I think if we
Yeah.
pulled all the water researchers in, they kind of all have their different ideas. But there's a lot of evidence showing that this is something that's happening. And some of the research from Martin Chaplin, he really talks about how the hydrogen in water could be that molecule, that element that's holding some of that information. And all of these quick changing dynamics that we see in water could be passing this information via hydrogen. Now, do I have a study to say, yes, absolutely, that's it? No, I don't. And again, that's why we need more funding. But we see this happening with all kinds of research, right? We see this with Luc Montagnier and Benveniste, and the capacity and digital biology overall as a field, right? The capacity for water to hold frequency information. And we see that with some of the work of like Emoto and Veda Austin. Again, this capacity to hold information, for water to hold information in memory. And when we're looking at fascia, going back to those tropocollagen nanotubules that are covered in structured water and that have a structured water flow inside of them, what we're talking about is this vast information system that has the capacity to guard and hold. So when we're talking about fascia, we're also talking about adhesions in fascia. And we're talking about how fascia is not always flowing like we're talking about, right? So when we experience trauma, both physical and emotional, we can experience what are called adhesions. And those can happen from physical trauma, from surgery, they're called interference fields, but also from emotional guarding, right? When we experience an emotional trauma. And when we look at what's happening when we're treating these adhesions, we see that, and usually what we're doing is a couple things. We're doing manual therapy there. So that fascia is being treated with a frequency, right? Like frequency specific microcurrent, for example, or it's being treated manually with pressure. And what both of those things are doing is they're creating an electrical charge. So our fascia, just like a quartz crystal, is piezoelectric. It is responsive to mechanical pressure. So if we compress it or deform it, right? Compress it down, deform it by stretching it, by moving it, it creates an electrical charge. And that's called a piezoelectric capacity, right? Just like this quartz crystal. And so when we do that with our fascia to release these adhesions, to work on these scars and interference fields, what we see is that pressure not only creates this electrical charge and infrared energy, but it releases hyaluronic acid. So these fibroblasts in the fascia release hyaluronic acid when there's pressure put and applied to fascia. And the crazy thing about this is this hyaluronic acid has a full hydration shell. And so it is surrounded by, one researcher calculated it at 1,600 water molecules around a single molecule of hyaluronic acid. And if your mind's going, how in the world is that possible? Well, water's really, really small, right? It's like the smallest molecule out there. So this capacity to bring in new structured water when we're working on our fascia, when we're tending to our fascia with manual release or frequency vibrations that again apply pressure via that oscillation or vibratory information, bringing in new structured water, new water that is fresh without that memory associated with it, it starts to paint a picture of something completely different than what we learned in school. And it's remarkable because when I was in naturopathic medical school and cadaver lab, fascia was something that you were moved away to get at the real organ or the real thing you want to study, right? And now we're understanding, oh, wait, not only does it provide the structure of these organs, it provides this body-wide network that is communicating. I mean, it is intimately associated with our lymphatics and our immune system, with our mitochondria, and has bidirectional communication, right? So all of these things are cross-talking with each other. And that's something that is completely new and alters our understanding of how our body works.
Yeah, it's crazy. I think about everyone foam rolling out there having no idea what they're actually doing, and when we realize this rabbit hole of fascia, it's cool. There's so much to kind of appreciate in terms of fascial health, and then the water network we talked about. But maybe the last question I have is around sound, because you talk a lot about sound. And this is also a different input signal, because it's not electromagnetic, it's not photonic in nature, but it kind of ties similarly to what you're just talking about in terms of mechanical pressure and piezoelectricity. And I've heard you mention that, sound is inducing also like infrared light being emitted or created in like our ear. And I'm curious if you could explain how sound is impacting our biology a little bit different, especially in regards to the biology around the ear and melanin. That's a cool one that I'm not too familiar with.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're talking about sound, what are we talking about? First of all, we're talking about pressure waves, right? And we won't go down the rabbit hole of how they're actual bubbles, but they're waves.
Oh, wow.
they're mechanical waves, right? They are pressure waves working through a medium. So they're working through air, and that's what we hear with our ear, or they're working through the body, right? Or water, right? That's what sound is. Without a medium, there's not these pressure waves. And these pressure waves excite those quantum particles we talked about, right? Electrons, protons, and that's how they get this interaction that we see in the body. And sound is really, really profound as far as how it impacts the body. And specifically, you're asking about melanin. And so we have melanin in our ears in the cochlea. And when these pressure waves of sound hit those melanocytes, what we're seeing is that melanin is converted into heat and light and electricity. There's someone out there called Tomatis, and Tomatis is a doctor who has come up with a theory of how this is the main energy source for the brain, actually. That conduction of sound via melanin in the ear, creating an electrical source that feeds our brain activity. And that's something that's wild to think about, right? But this conversion that we see in melanin from light to heat and electricity also goes the other way, right? It's bidirectional. So you can take heat and electricity, and melanin can turn that into light, right? And that starts to make a little more sense about why do we have melanin on our skin and in our retina in our eyes? Well, because we're exposed to external light, right? And we know that melanin splits that water, creating molecular hydrogen and molecular water, or excuse me, molecular oxygen. Both can be used by the mitochondria. But then you start to dig deeper and you say, wow, we have melanin in our brain. We have it in our internal organs. Well, what's going on why would we have that there? And so then we kind of come full circle back to this idea of this light conversation in the body and how it can be converted to different signals via melanin. And we start to see, oh, wow, like it isn't just a light conversation, it's a frequency conversation. It's a conversation of magnetism and electricity and sound and all happening in this water, this sea of water that we're bathing in. And it starts to really ripple out the consequences of this. And so it's really incredible when we start to look. It's a fascinating rabbit hole to come down to. And it's really interesting to see how a lot of our senses are quantum biological in nature, right? Melanin in our sight, in our eyes, in our ear, these G-coupled receptors in our olfaction and our olfactory response, our sense of smell, those aren't only in the nose, right? Same thing happening with melanin. Why would we have olfactory receptors in our muscles, in our breast tissue, in our prostate, right? What's going on there? There is sensory information being transmitted internally that's not just at the site of smell or olfaction in the nose, right? This is traveling throughout the body. So again, it's implying this vast language of frequency in the body and how we can utilize it for better health if we understand it, right? If we continue to research it and continue to understand it and acknowledge it, right? The research is out there. I didn't come up with this, right? I found it in the research, but this is not something you find in mainstream doctor offices out there, and it should be simple interventions of light, sound, of smell. I mean, all of these things can be really impactful, really inexpensive usually, and they're completely appreciated and underutilized.
Incredible. Don't even get us started on sense of direction. But Catherine, thank you so much. This has been a pleasure. I think it's such an incredible overview. You know, in an hour, quantum biology can always dive deeper, but it's really important and it covered a lot. So I'm curious, people do want to learn more from you. Where can they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just Dr. Catherine Clinton everywhere. So that's where you can find me on social media, on YouTube. My website is drcatherineclinton.com. And I just love sharing this information. I really believe that what you're doing here with this radio show, what I do is sharing information. We are creating that bottom up change. So I'd love to continue the conversation. You guys can find me out there.
Amazing. That's Catherine with a C. And yeah, thanks so much for tuning in, everyone. We'll see you next time.